Hi, I'm Radical Liberation, self-declared King of the Moon, and I have with me the Mad Mercenary. He's back.
Hello.
So you complain sometimes, but we've never really talked about it. You're saying that the internet, which prevented you from joining us last week, the internet is a public utility in Australia? What's the arrangement?
National Broadband Network, NBN. It was
Okay.
effectively nationalized under the Rudd government and has been ever a strain on everyone's productivity ever since.
Wait, so when would that be? I don't know anything about the Rudd government. Give me a rough year.
Shoot, 20. I want to say 2012, but that could be wrong. We've
Okay,
had
so
we've
on the
had
order
like
of
six or
on the
seven.
order of a decade of it being
We've
a nationalized internet, basically.
we've had 6 or 7 prime ministers in this time frame when we've pretty much only meant to have had 2. So
Wow.
it's been a wild ride as to see who's actually in office the next day.
Right.
Yeah,
But
it's
anyway,
horrible.
there had been, I assume that before 8 years ago, there was something a little bit more like what I'm used to in the US. Internet was provided by various companies and stuff, right?
It was an oligopoly, but it was still private.
Mm-hmm.
It was not very good, but it was still better than what we have now. Essentially,
So
they took.
declines in quality once it went from oligopolistic or whatever to nationalized have been noticeable.
Yeah, exactly. It was
Mm.
it was not great, and it's still not great. I'm sure there are some people who can obviously talk about this way more. I just complain about it because it's horrible.
Eli
And
Green says. Eli Green says, "I always wondered why Australian internet was so trash."
well, we have worse internet than Romania. So
Oh, really?
just to put that, to put that in example, a Cold War, post-Soviet bloc nation that's
Right.
highly corrupt has better internet than us.
Well, some people.
That's how bad it is.
It's all about the direction of motion, right? Some of us are. Some nations are going away from socialism, and some are going towards it. Right.
Yes, exactly.
And in the case of Australia, and at least in the case of the internet, they moved it to socialized internet, essentially, right?
Well, it's really weird. There's a mixture. It's a mixture of public and private interests, as they would put it. But it's really just the state owns the lines, and the companies lease it out. I'm not particularly familiar with how the ins and out of that arrangement works, but it's essentially the National Broadband Network is owned by the Australian government, and they lay all the cable or fiber optic cable now. Funny story, they laid a whole bunch of copper cable, and then they had to dig it all up and lay in fiber optic cable halfway through the process.
Because they realized that the copper wasn't going to do it?
Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of expenditure wasted.
Yeah.
Jury rigging says Australian internet is boomerang driven. That's probably not as funny to people who live in Australia who are sick of all those sort of jokes. But anyway.
Yeah, it's okay.
So I threw it up there. Well, EF Casual says, I know Romania has great internet due to V. Oh, meaning V lets us know how great the internet is, right?
Okay.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so let's just cover a few very quick things. One of which is that I'll start off with, which is that just mention it again in case you missed our first couple shows of the year, that we have changed the structure of the show. So usually we have started with minis, but now we're breaking those out into their own week so that we can be a weekly show. So last week we did minis. The week before that we did a large topic, the path of blood and fire. I still think it is timely and recommend it. And then this week, again, we're going to do a larger focused topic. And then next week, we'll be back to minis. So that's the idea, alternating minis and main topic to give you something every week. So I hope you like it. And in fact, that's a good time to say, please support the show. You'll see in the show description, we've got Subscribe Star. Of course, there's super chats here on YouTube. We have not set up a membership thing on YouTube. I haven't really even talked about it with Mad Merc. Like, what would that mean? And could we give something for the different levels of membership? And I don't know. You have to kind of design your membership program if you're going to do something like that. But for now, our main sources of support for the show are Subscribestar, Super Chats, and a little bit of ad money from Google, and then Bitcoin. Also in the show description, or contact me about that. So,
and guys, we are looking at alternative platforms. Don't worry, we are looking at Rumble. We are looking at DLive. We are looking at what's that? LBRY Libri or whatever it's called.
Library.
Library. Yeah. Sorry, Library. We're looking at Entropy. Definitely looking at Entropy. We know some of the folks there. They're good people. We're taking a bit of time to try and figure out which one we want to go down, and because we need to invest a little bit of time in actually uploading the videos there and setting up a profile and setting up a monetary incentive for us to do it. So, just give us a little bit of time. We are trying to set this all up.
Yes, and then finally, as usual, we shill AA's Econ course. In fact, in some ways, you could view this whole episode as a shill for his course, because in the sense that we're going to see the power of economics applied to a really important issue. And I'm hoping that this will give you a taste for economics and leave you wanting to learn more. And if you do, if you get to the end of this and go, wow, economics can like really help you understand the world, then there's a number of paths you could take. But one great one would be to take the course by Academic Agent. Foundations of Economics. And again, look at the show description, and there's even a little discount code there for you if you'd like to give it a whirl. Okay, so by and large is impossible. That's a reference to the movie Wall-E. I'll talk about that more at the end. But what do I hope that we'll learn today, going through this epic paper by Ludwig von Mises from literally 100 years ago? It was published in 1920. Socialism is impossible. We'll explain what we mean by that. By and large is also impossible. We'll learn about money prices. We'll learn about structure of production, learn about the importance of private ownership of the means of production. We'll learn the difference between a technical problem versus an economic problem. Failing to make that distinction has led to a lot of confusion, and so much more. And this is why I suggested when I was marketing the show that this is a great way to have an entry point into economics. I think as we go through this paper, you'll be introduced to really critical aspects of economics in a context that makes them not so dry and boring, right? Because if I just say structure of production, that's like sounds like very academic. But when you see that understanding the structure of production is crucial to understanding why socialism can't work, then it makes it a little more interesting. And you might want to actually dig a little more into economics, learn a little bit more about how money works, how money prices work, what the structure of production is. So anyway, that's marketing for the topic today. I hope you're interested. Let's see how we're doing here. We've got plenty of people with us. And by the way, I don't know if Mad Merc and I pay attention to this, but the show slowly but surely grows. We have more people live for the show. We get more viewers of each show each time. More financial support. By all the various metrics, this show is doing well. So thanks everyone for your support and for marketing the show, which we'll get to later, because one of our loyal viewers did some guerrilla marketing, I think it's called, right? So we'll definitely be telling you about that. Okay, so let me share this paper by Ludwig von Mises. Okay, did I share the right thing? Let's see. Nope, I didn't. Let me try that again. Too many things with the same title. There we go. That looks more like it. Okay, let's go to the top of the paper. All right, so this is an article that Mises published in 1920. Sorry, where's the title page? Here we go. Economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth. This is a gangbang of an article. It's amazing. It is super. It has a world within it, as I was trying to hint. There's been so much discussion sparked by this article. There's famous articles that people have read by Hayek, and they haven't even read this one. And they've read the article by Hayek, which is really, you could say, a footnote to the debate that Mises sparked with this article. So this article is, in literature, someone talked about it. We've all come out from under the overcoat, a famous story by Gogol, I think. In a way, there's been a whole 20th century economic debate that all comes out from under economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth. So this is just an epic article. All right, so we're going to go through it piece by piece and try to break it down. Mad Merc, I want you to feel free to slow me down, ask questions, because there's a lot to cover, but also I want to make sure people are actually understanding it. Oh, I'm not going to go over it, but this edition from the Mises Institute. Oh, and I meant to share the link. Get your own copy of the article in PDF, HTML, or whatever you like, right at this link I'm putting in the chat right now. There we go, for free. And it has an introduction, which is really fun because the introduction is from a Polish professor in a very interesting time, April 1990. For those who know about the fortunes of communism in the 20th century, that's a very interesting time for him to be commenting on Mises's 1920 paper, right? And in fact, he does directly talk about the changes we're witnessing in 1989 and so forth. Anyway, I didn't want to go through this because there's so much of Mises to cover, but just wanted to quote this one section, which I thought was fun, of a brief, interesting summary of what actually happened as they implemented socialism, in his case in Poland. There was no place for private ownership, he says, nor for the market. The only method of coordinating economic activity was government command and bureaucratic allocation. What was the result? The result, now remember, socialism had promised that it would get rid of the inefficiencies of the anarchy and the anarchy of the market. You know, why are there 12 shoe manufacturers? You know, this is crazy. This is inefficient. They're duplicating each other's efforts. We'll have one shoe manufacturer. They will make the right shoe that everybody needs, you know. The socialists saw, this is hard to remember now, but take yourself back a little bit to the time where 1920 and before. The socialists saw the free market as inefficient, okay? That's really key to understand. It's hard to remember. They saw it as inefficient, as wasteful, as duplicating effort, as anarchic in the bad sense of the term, you know, chaotic. So what actually happened when they replaced the coordination by the market with the coordination by government command and bureaucratic allocation? The result was a prolonged crisis marked by a stagnation or decrease of production by inflation, ecological disaster, more people should make note of this, because of wasteful use of all types of resources, energy, water, forests, etc., by falling standards of living, and by widespread public frustration and social pathology. And I think many of my right-wing friends would say we're having plenty of social pathology, even without fully trying on socialism. We're getting a good taste of that already. Yeah, ecological disaster, I could go on about that, but there's some stuff that happened in the Soviet Union, if you don't know about it, that will curl your toes ecologically, and our whole planet will be living with the consequences, ecological consequences, for forever, basically. They made such a mess over there. So anyway, great introduction by the Polish economist, and now Mises himself. Here's what he says. The socialists have been in a mode of critique, right? He says they've criticized the economic structure of free society, but they have neglected to apply to the economics of the socialist state the same caustic acumen, right? And here's where you may not know this, but Mises can be funny. They invariably explain how, in the cloud cuckoo lands of their fancy, roast pigeons will in some way fly into the mouths of the comrades, but they omit to show how this miracle is to take place. So if you know anything about Marx, you know that his longest work was a multi-volume thing called Das Kapital. It is a critique of capitalism. A very flawed critique, but never mind that. The point here is it's a critique of capitalism. It's not, as you might think, a blueprint for how to have a Marxist socialist economy. You'd think he might have touched on that, but he says no. None of the Marxists, at least in 1920, had spent any time thinking about how this would actually work. They just talked about how bad capitalism was, and that's the underpants gnomes, right? Question mark, step 3, socialism is awesome, right? Step 1, capitalism is terrible. Step 2, question mark. Step 3, socialism is going to be a lot better, more efficient and more just and great and everything, right? And Mises said, let's slow down and look at step 2 there, right? How is this system actually going to work? And so that's really what this paper does. And believe it or not, I think he's right. I mean, I've done a little bit of reading of the socialists of that period. And I think he's pretty much right that no one had really thought about the problems that he raises. Now, remember, this is 1920. It's kind of a little late to be bringing it up, But to be fair to Mises, no one had been doing it. The people who should have been doing it weren't. By 1920, the Soviet Union was a couple years into trying to really shift the country in a seriously socialist direction. And no one had thought about how to do it. In fact, later, we won't go into it today, but later on, he talks about Lenin and quotes from Lenin and says, look at what Lenin's doing here. He doesn't have a plan. He's just kind of responding from day to day, from crisis to crisis. He doesn't have a blueprint or a map of where he's going. There is no trust the plan there, one might say, with Lenin. So, okay, so that's the point of the introduction to a great degree, is they haven't been thinking about it. It's time to think about it. So, under socialism, all the means of production are the property of the community. It is the community alone which can dispose of them and which determines their use in production. So, if you haven't heard this definition before, socialism is often defined, especially the Marxist flavors of socialism, as communal ownership or communal control of the means of production, socialization of the means of production, right? So what they're saying is, and sometimes you'll hear lefties, bread tube types talk about personal property versus private property, right? So personal property would be your toothbrush, right? They're like, we're not going to take your toothbrush away. We're not going to take the teddy bear away from your child. That belongs to you. It's not. We're not totally against property. We're for personal property. We're just against private property. And what do they mean by that? Basically, they mean the means of production. We've got to organize the economy. Go ahead.
Right. Just before we dive into this paper, for any of the socialist people who do watch this show, and we do have a couple, and we thank you for watching. We obviously appreciate the fact that you're willing to expand your mind.
Definitely.
However, please don't go into the comments and go, well, this is one form of socialism. I'm a anarcho-syndicalist, blah, blah, blah. Look, we're just discussing the paper today. We'll discuss syndicalism and fascism and national socialism and communism and all the other different variants, democratic socialism, even though it's not very democratic or whatever, later. Just want to make that clear.
Right. Yeah. We could go off in all kinds of directions. In particular, I guess when we talk about socialism here, as it will be clear, he's talking about socialism at scale, right? There's a form of something that we could fairly call socialism, which no one objects to. That's the socialism of the family, of the monastery, of the commune. If a few people want to get together and live in a sort of socialist fashion, knock yourself out. No one has any problems with it ethically, nor does anyone think it particularly is doomed to failure. Some mini communes have failed, but some lasted for a long, long time. So on a small scale, it's fine. What we're talking here is the real the thing that was the big debate, right, and which people tried to put into effect throughout the 20th century, and that is socialism on a big scale, and that's socializing the means of production. Okay, so right, so this is such a key point, and it points to something that the classical economists got confused. I think John Stuart Mill, as usual, might be a bit of a villain here. He says, it is characteristic of socialism that the distribution of consumption goods must be independent of the question of production and of its economic conditions. Okay, what does he mean? Say's law could be summarized in a simple way, I think, by saying that production and distribution are not different things. They're the same thing, in essence. How is it that someone is able to consume in the market economy? It's because they produced, or someone produced and gave them money, whatever. But basically, there's the correlation between production and consumption, or you could say distribution, is 1-to-1. That's Say's law. Okay. Well, the whole point of socialism is to break that, right? If you're not breaking that, you just have a market economy. So he's saying something that should be kind of obvious. The socialist system wants to produce and decide how to distribute in some kind of equitable way, or to those who need it the most, right, or something like that, right? That's like the whole point of socialism, right? So he establishes that first, very critical distinction. Okay, now let me see what else I wanted to cover here. Yeah, okay. He just teases out the meanings of this. And then he says, even in a socialist economy, you're going to have consumption, and you're going to have people making consumption choices, okay? And that is going to result in demand. Okay, so he's saying that in a socialist economy, there will be demand. And he starts talking about alcohol and cigarettes versus cigars or whatever, and so forth, right? He says, there is going to be revealed in a socialist economy, like in every economy, that there's a certain amount of cigarettes that people want and a certain amount of this and that people want, right?
Not only, sorry, just to jump in there, not only that people want stuff, but that these wants change over time. Because obviously, as we know from manga, that value is subjective. Value is constantly changing for the individual, and they make different choices based on thousands and thousands of different factors that go on in their own head, whether that be personal, whether that be exogenous factors that's happening around them in their environment. These decisions are made with thousands of inputs, and they change constantly. So people will always want, and they will always want different things at different times, at different points in their life for different reasons. Just to make that clear.
So not only is there consumer demand in the socialist system, but it's shifting. It's a shifting consumer demand. It's not set, right?
Yes, we're not robots. We are not robots. Right. Everything is always changing. It's fluid.
And he says there'll even be exchange in a socialist economy. But the exchanges will be between consumer goods, consumption goods. So, I'll trade some of my beer for your cigarettes or something like that. But the whole point of being in a socialist system is that the production goods are exclusively communal. They're inalienable property of the community. And thus they are outside of commerce, private commerce, right? Okay, so the principal exchange can operate freely in a socialist state within those narrow limits. That is within consumer goods and not producer goods. And therefore, he says, there could be money in a socialist state. Now, that's a little controversial because I think even the Bolsheviks early on tried to just abolish money. It didn't last long, but there would be a use for money, but it's going to be limited, right? Because you can't use your money to invest in a business by means of production. you can only, use your money to buy cigarettes from somebody who has cigarettes or something like that. But not, yeah. So it'd be much narrower in the use of money. And therefore, production goods won't be exchanged in the way consumer goods would. And so you won't have a monetary price on producer goods. Consumer goods, you could, hey, I'd like to buy some cigarettes off you. Well, they're, this many rubles, right? I'll take this many rubles for them. But the whole point of a socialist system is you can't buy a factory or things like that. That's owned by, the community or whatever, or the state or however you do it. And so you would not have calculation in terms of money for production goods. Okay, and this is, we're going to go into detail on this, but this is the key point. You don't have calculation in terms of money. What the heart of the paper here explains is why this is a problem, that you don't have calculations in terms of money for production goods. Okay, so I'm going to ignore all that. Okay, so nature of economic calculation. So every man who in the course of economic life takes a choice between the satisfaction of one need as against another, eo ipso makes a judgment of value. And the judgment of value is only on the satisfaction of the need itself. But Mises says that judgment of value, when I buy a cigarette or a beer or whatever, that reflects back upon the goods of a lower and then further upon goods of a higher order. Okay, now here we need to slow down, make sure you're going to get this, because this is really key to understanding his whole argument. The footnote says, by lower order, Mises refers to those goods made for final consumption. By higher order, those used in production. So I buy beer, and I just get my beer, and I value this beer, and I pay $2 for it or whatever, and I'm happy to have the beer for $2, right? But when I buy that beer, he says that reflects back, sort of backwards through the process of production on the things that went into making the beer, right? So the price of hops, the price of beer tanks or whatever those tall things are you see at the microbreweries, right? Et cetera, et cetera. All those things they use to make beer have value because people are out there buying cans of beer, right? If everyone stops buying cans of beer tomorrow, then the things for making the beer, the hops, the price for these things, all in a market economy, it's all going to collapse, right? Or go much lower, depending on what else those things are being used for. So the value people put on the final consumer good reflects back to what he calls the higher orders of production. And all that means is, as you go higher, you get more distant from the final thing that you actually buy and hold in your hand, and you're dealing with the tools and the factory and the process and so on and so forth. Go ahead, Menmer.
Right. In the same sense, the steel that was made to use the factory has value because people want the factory to make do whatever they do with hops. I'm not particularly familiar with the process of alcohol to make beer, right?
Right.
In the same sense, the tools that were used to mine the ore that were later going to be turned into the machinery or the foundations of the building that's then used for doing whatever with the hops to create beer, that has value because people want beer, or they have alternative uses for the steel and the tools and all this sort of stuff. So it all comes down to the lower order good having value that gives the higher order goods value as well, because they can be used to create the lower order goods.
Exactly. So let's continue a little bit here.
It's not based on labor. That's not where things get their value.
Right. That's true. But we're not going to worry too much about the labor theory of value today. You're right, though. Okay. So he said. So Mises makes a crucial distinction here as we go from the lower order, the consumer good, backwards into these higher order parts of production. Right. He says, as a rule, a man knows his own mind is in a position to value goods of a lower order. I know how much I want to spend on the beer or whatever, right? And he says, even in simple conditions, he might have some idea of the significance of goods of a somewhat higher order. But where there's things are more involved. There's more interconnections. As he says, subtler means must be employed to accomplish a correct valuation of the means of production. That is, the guy buying the beer doesn't know whether we ought to open a new mine for iron ore, right? That's now getting really distant from the valuation he puts on that can of beer. Well, are there other things that iron ore needs to be used for? Are there plenty of mines? We don't need another mine to open. I mean, now it's getting really complicated as you get away from that final consumer good. So an example he gives here: it is quite a different matter when the choice lies between the utilization of a watercourse for the manufacture of electricity, or the extension of a coal mine, or the drawing up of plans for the better employment of the energies latent in raw coal. So there he gives, I think, like 3 choices there, right? We're going to spend some money on energy. The Energy Central Planning Committee, we could put up a dam to get electricity. We could dig further in this coal mine, sort of invest more in this coal mine, or we could figure out how to more efficiently use the coal that we're already getting from the coal mine. There's like 3 things that we could invest in, right? How do we pick? Okay. Here, the roundabout processes of production are many. Each is very lengthy. Here, the conditions necessary for the success of the enterprises which are to be initiated are diverse, so that one cannot apply merely vague valuations, but requires rather more exact estimates and some judgment of the economic issues actually involved. Okay, and then I don't know why I highlighted this value. Okay. Well, here he's making a point here, which is that when we make a judgment of value, it's not a measurement. So when I say that, I like beer more than cigarettes or something, that just puts it on a scale. That for me, a can of beer is greater than a pack of cigarettes, say. But this does not give us this gives us what's called an ordinal, an ordering, so maybe an ordinal number, so cigarettes is 1, pack of cigarettes is 1, and a can of beer is 1 on my list of things I want, and pack of cigarettes is 2, and something else is 3, right? But that doesn't mean that you have you can do math on that, right? This is not a cardinal number. That is, you can't say that therefore beer is twice as good as cigarettes, or 1.5 times as good, or something like that. It doesn't really give you anything like that.
And again, this is assuming that you can understand this for every single individual, and not only understand this for every single individual, but also have a way of calculating it, and also have a way of have it constantly changing for every individual's subjective needs that are also constantly changing. So again, we need to keep this in mind when we're talking about all this ordinal stuff and the ranking of priorities for what we want to consume or acquire. This is constantly subjective and changing. So just to make that very clear to everyone. I know I'm harping on about this point, but it's really important.
No, it is. Right now he's laying a little groundwork of how the exchange economy, the market economy, as opposed to the socialist system we're considering here. How does the market economy work, right? He says the objective exchange value of commodities enters as the unit of economic calculation. That is, there's a sort of strange language here, but he just means the price, right? So, there's a price for iron ore. There's a price for steel, and so forth. And these are used in making economic calculation to make production decisions. So there's a threefold advantage in this system where the price, this objective exchange value, meaning, okay, slow down. Subjective exchange value is just my judgment that I want this beer, right? Objective exchange value is the price. That means it's not just something inside me that I can't really fully convey to anyone else, right? Objective exchange value, we can all understand. Yeah, $2.15 for this can of beer. get it. We all get it, right? So that's what he means by objective. It's something that everybody sees. So what are the advantages? He says there's 3 advantages. First, it renders it possible to base calculations upon the valuations of all participants in trade. So by having this objective, this price on things, we can start calculating, right? I don't know how to put a number on you liking beer more than cigarettes, but I understand $2.15. And I can start thinking, well, if I sell you that for $2.15, will that cover my costs? And, so on and so forth, right? So calculation by exchange value furnishes a control over the appropriate employment of goods. That is, you can use the price to make decisions, right? And then let's see. Yeah, so then here it comes, the complicated process of production, right? Like we were talking about, the 3 different possible things you could do to invest in energy. How do you figure out how to do that in the market economy? You use the prices, and you figure out if you're going to be able to, if something might be profitable. If it's not able to be profitable, that tells you that others know how to make better use of the goods of higher order in question. So that's really one of the things it means to talk about profit and loss in a market economy. Profit tells me I'm making a reasonably good use of these means of production. Loss tells me I better stop doing this and let somebody else use this stuff because I'm being wasteful, right? It tells you whether you're being productive or wasteful. That's what profit and loss means. So calculation by exchange value makes it possible to refer values back to a unit, a cardinal unit that you can do math with, right? Profit and loss calculation. And in a monetary economy, it is money that accomplishes this. And then he does a little thing, which I don't want to go into this deeply, but I think this is important because he's really addressing some of the things that I hear from both right and left. He says, look, monetary calculation is really important, and this whole paper helps you to understand how important it is, but it has its limits. Money is not a yardstick of value. That is, because something has a certain price, that doesn't tell me how valuable it is in an ethical sense, how valuable it is to you, okay? Let's see, the exchange relationship which obtains between money and goods is subjected to constant, if as a rule, not too violent fluctuations, originating not only from the side of other economics goods, but also from the side of money. Highlighted that kind of to make the point that Mad Merck's been hitting on, which is that there's some play in this, there's some movement. Oh yeah, so going back to this thing of money doesn't capture everything, right? You can't put a price on this, right? Mises says, yeah, of course you can't. we know that, right? He says if a man were to calculate the profitability of erecting a waterworks, he would not be able to include in his calculation the beauty of the waterfall, which the scheme might impair. And yet these considerations might be the deciding factor. So he says, we could talk about these things as being extra economic, beauty, spiritual concerns, things like that. He says, in any place where men regard as significant the beauty of a neighborhood or of a building, the health, happiness, and contentment of mankind, the honor of individuals or nations, they are just as much motive forces of rational conduct as are economic factors in the proper sense of the word. So remember, with Mises and the Austrian school in general, you do not get homo economicus, the imaginary person who all he thinks about is money. Maybe Scrooge is the closest we have in terms of a fictional character, right? All that matters is how much does it cost, right? That's the only thing that's going on. Mises says that's not real. In real life, people consider these various things, and it guides their decisions, right? And among the things that guide their decisions are money prices, but it isn't the only thing that guides them. That's absurd. Go ahead.
This is one of the things that people kind of miss. People think that economics, especially when you think about the normal mainstream schools of economics, they kind of think, well, economics is only to do with money. Economics is only, no. Economics is about a value judgment. Economics is everything. When you make a value judgment about one thing to another thing, and compare and contrast and doing all these sorts of complex thoughts in your head. That's economics. You're still trying to choose between two things and what you should invest your time into. And there are multiple factors. Again, like I was saying, there are thousands of different factors that go into a value judgment. So let's say someone doesn't want to sell a car and would prefer for it to rust because they don't want to lower the price. Well, okay, they've set their price too high, but they've also made a value judgment in saying, well, I don't want to sell the car for anything lower. And that's a personal value judgment.
Yep. There's nothing wrong with it. As
nothing
Mises
wrong
said,
with that.
There's nothing irrational. It's not like outside of, people say things like economics can't understand that people put another value on things besides money prices. Well, Austrian economics understands that. Okay. So
100% understands that.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it really, if you think about it carefully, you realize that the Homo economicus story, where all people are thinking about is money prices, makes no sense, because where does the value come to anything if all you're thinking about is money, right? Like, why do I feed my family? If all I really cared about is money, then I guess I would just stop feeding my family and let them starve. They're just a cost to me, right? Well, that's absurd. No one really lives that way. That's not the real world.
What's the point in accumulation of wealth if you can't use it? I mean, people are not robots. We don't singularly focus in on one thing.
Sure. I mean, I'm sure there's somebody that all they care about is make the line go up on their personal wealth, right? They don't want to use it for anything. They just want to have the biggest number when they die, like they're playing a video game or something. Maybe there is someone like that, but probably not. Okay, so he says monetary calculation cannot embrace these factors, but this is not a problem, because all those ideal goods are goods of a lower order, and they can be embraced within the ambit of our judgment of values. That is, when we make decisions about, trade-offs between what to buy, what not to buy, what to do with our time, so on and so forth, we are incorporating all those higher values, spiritual values, and so on and so forth, right? Maybe I'm a real nationalist. I want to keep America for the Americans, and so I buy things made in America. Knock yourself out, right? That's fine. That's perfectly good. There's nothing uneconomic about that, irrational about it. You're expressing your values and what you choose to buy.
By the way, that's something that I do. I will purposely, if I have a choice, I will purposely buy Australian over something that is foreign made, even if it's maybe 10% higher or 20% higher, whatever the price is, particularly because I want to support local businesses and local farmers and all that sort of good stuff, in my opinion. But someone else may not, and that's perfectly fine. Again.
Yes. Yep. And then I had to include this little passage because, again, it addresses this thing that just keeps coming up. He says, it may seem painful to any sensitive spirit to have to balance spiritual goods against material. I have to decide to feed my family versus giving all my money to the church or something like that. Why, oh, why, Lord, oh, why do you make me trade off against these things? He says that's not the fault of monetary calculation. That's not an economic problem. That's a reality problem. Reality presents us with hard choices and with scarcity. As we'll see, proper economic calculation can reduce how hard some of those choices are sometimes, right? Because of the way it lets the economy function. But it doesn't get rid of the fundamental nature of reality, which is that I want to do two things at the same time that are both awesome things, and I can't do both of them. I have to pick one. Well, tough luck, buddy. Stop blaming economics. That's just life, Okay, so, and then he, again, same point. Who should seek to estimate the extent of human losses through immigrations or wars in terms of money? Again, he's just saying we can't put money on prices on everything, and that's totally understood. It's not what we're dealing with here. Okay, so nevertheless, within those limits, having dealt with that little rabbit hole there, monetary calculation fulfills all the requirements of economic calculation. This is fun language here. It affords us a guide through the oppressive plenitude of economic potentialities, right? There's so many different things we can do in terms of what to make, how to make it, so on and so forth. It's really too complicated for any person to understand. but it enables us to extend to all goods of a higher order the judgment of value. It renders their value capable of computation. So now you have a money price, you can actually do math on it, arithmetic on it, right? And so it gives us the primary basis for all economic operations with goods of a higher order. Without it, all production involving processes stretching well back in time and all the longer roundabout processes of capitalistic production would be gropings in the dark. And that's one of the things I remember taking away from this paper, that image of people trying to run their economy and being blindfolded. Because in the socialist economy, you don't have prices for the means of production. And so you don't know what you're doing. You don't know if you're using that steel in an efficient way. You're just kind of arbitrarily making decisions that are unconnected to economic considerations. So there are two conditions governing the possibility of calculating value in terms of money. First, not only must goods of a lower, but also those of a higher order come within the ambit of exchange if they are to be included. So he's saying if we're going to calculate value in terms of money, we can't just have our toothbrush prices on our toothbrushes, our consumer goods. It has to be these higher order goods, iron ore and mines and tools, factories, so on and so forth. They have to also be included. Second condition is that there needs to be a universally employed medium of exchange, what we call money. But all money, the word money, don't get too caught up by it. It just means the most widely accepted medium of exchange. He says we need that. If we don't have money, it's not possible to reduce all the exchange relationships to a common denominator. Okay, that is, we can't really think. It just doesn't work to think in terms of iron ore versus silver ore versus a piece of bread. I mean, or whatever, these pairs. I mean, in reality, that's really what we're doing. We're deciding that I'm going to think about the cost of cigarettes relative to the cost of beer. So it's cigarettes to beer is the ratio, right? But we can't really run the economy that way. They need to all have the common denominator of a money price. Otherwise, we can't, cigarettes to beer, we don't know what to do with that ratio relative to steel versus silver ratio. These ratios can't be added, or you can't do arithmetic with them. So you need that money price in there so that you can start making decisions across all these producer goods. Okay, so right, so that's how it works. That's how the exchange economy works. That's how our economy works, is that you have private ownership of the means of production, that there is money prices for those means of production, and we're able to use those money prices to make decisions about investment and so on and so forth, so that we can hopefully choose a profitable path and stop going down loss-making paths, and therefore do things in what's called an economic or an efficient way. Don't waste everything, right? Don't destroy everything to produce something that no one even wants. So what happens when we move away from this? As soon as one gives up the conception of a freely established monetary price for goods of a higher order, rational production becomes completely impossible. Every step that takes us away from private ownership of the means of production and from the use of money also takes us away from rational economics. Now, he says, here's what makes it tricky. And an academic agent commented on my tweet about the show. He says, the thing you have to understand when Mises says that socialism is impossible, he's not exactly talking about the USSR, because the USSR is what Mises is talking about here, a socialistic oasis in a society with monetary exchange, which is still a free society to a certain degree. So the Soviet Union could look at the prices generated by the market economies around it. And by the way, they actually did that. They actually had like a subscription to the Wall Street Journal. I'm not kidding. And they would actually look at prices and stuff like that. I remember hearing about it. The Mises Institute has a guy who, was involved with the Soviet Union near the end of its time there, Yuri Maltsev, who I've spoken to. They actually would look at market prices. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just about to say, I forget who said it. but there was someone who said if the world turned socialist, they would still leave Hong Kong to get prices.
Right. Yeah. That's the old joke. Absolutely. Good one. Thank you. And he says, so in a sense, for right wingers like to talk about how, that's socialism, or like we were just saying, the internet was socialized, right? And he says, well, in a sense, nationalization and municipalization of enterprise is not really socialism, because they're little pockets of socialistic oases inside a society that has prices. And so they can actually use those prices to make decisions that aren't completely whacked out. As we know, as government takes over something like the internet in Australia, we discussed at the top of the show, you do start these nevertheless. But you don't see quite the impossible situation that Mises is talking about here. You just see it get less efficient. So he says, in those kinds of undertakings where the state's taken over some little sector, they do take technical improvements because they see private enterprise doing them, and they go, ooh. In fact, I think Mad Merck might have given us exactly the example we needed for this, namely that they were laying down copper, and somehow, one wonders how they figured this out, they decided, maybe we should be using fiber, and this copper was a bad idea. In a world of socialist internet where they'd all decided to do copper, maybe they wouldn't have done that. Do you follow me, Mad Merck?
Yeah, 100%. And we this is one of the things, right? If you have the higher order goods with no prices and it's all controlled by the state or by a single entity. In fact, we can come on around to this with private industry and how large private industry can actually fall prey to this problem as well. But we'll come back to that. When you don't have prices on higher order goods, and you can't actually understand what the value of something is on the market, and see what this resource should be used for, and see what the demand is for certain lower order goods. Without all this huge process, you actually just have a commissar or someone at the back just deciding arbitrarily, oh, well, I guess we should have, I don't know, 10,000 loaves of bread produced monthly or whatever. And this is the amount of machinery that should be allocated to that. And as many states have found, when you just do this arbitrary decision making without any sort of economic calculation, you run into huge shortages or surpluses or waste or just ecological disaster, because there's no way to know how much of what type at what location a good should be sold.
Right. And I appreciate that you said shortages or surpluses, because the simplistic view, which is not totally wrong, right? The simplistic view is that there was just shortages of everything in the Soviet Union. But in fact, if you dig into the details a bit, you find exactly what you said. It's not exactly that there were shortages of everything. It was just wrong. There was too much of this and too little of that. It was just, they just couldn't come up with the right answers because they didn't have a functioning market economy, a fully functioning market economy. Okay, so he says, for these little, Australia socializes its internet, they can kind of function and they can kind of borrow from private industries around them and make use of the prices that are going on in the market economy around them. But he says in a purely socialist environment, you would not have that. And you'd have no economic calculation, and you'd have, he says, no economy. Now that sounds a little confusing, right? Because sometimes we think of economy as just, well, we're making stuff, so we have an economy, right? He says, it's not really what an economy is. That's where you get into sort of the cargo cult problem, right? We're going through the motions of an economy, so we have an economy. Well, no. An economy is, well, the thing we're trying to understand here, right? It's something that where people use money prices to make economizing decisions. When it's all, like Mad Merck said, just a commissar issuing orders, you don't really have an economy. You just have people doing stuff that they're told to do. So he says,
usually with a gun to the back of their head, but that's another story.
Yeah, we're not emphasizing the role of that force ends up playing in all of this, but yeah, it hangs over all this like a dark shadow. So he says, in the socialist state where you have no economic calculation, you might be able to have some rational conduct in trivial and secondary matters, but in general, it would be impossible to speak of rational production anymore. There would be no means of determining what was rational. And hence it is obvious that production could never be directed by economic considerations. So without money prices to figure out what's a profitable way to produce things, they wouldn't know what rational production would even look like. So they're not going to just randomly land on it. Now, hopefully it's obvious why you wouldn't just get lucky. But if it isn't obvious to you, you might want to read the classic by Leonard Read, I, Pencil, where he talks about the whole, it's a little book, but it's all about everything that goes into just making a single pencil. And after you read that, you could understand why you're not going to just get lucky. There's so much complexity, so many choices in an intertwinkled economy like we have now. You're not just going to randomly get lucky and hit on the efficient thing that would have come out of a free market process. Now, this is a really interesting comment, quick rabbit hole here. He says, would there in fact be any such thing as rational conduct at all, or indeed such a thing as rationality and logic in thought itself? Historically, human rationality is development of economic life. Could it then obtain when divorced therefrom? I don't want to go deep on that, but there. You cut out. I did. There. Okay. Yeah. So he's saying, would there be logic? Would we have rationality as we currently understand it if we destroy economic life? He doesn't try to answer the question, but he says, it's worth thinking about. You might remember that our earliest examples of writing that we find are commercial. It's people like making up receipts and stuff, an ancient Babylonian or whatever the heck, older than that, some Mesopotamian language. So there's some historical basis for what he's saying here. Anyway, I thought that was an intriguing thought. What'll happen? He says, in place of the economy of the anarchic method of production, he's using the smear term that socialists would use of the free market or the market. Recourse will be had to the senseless output of an absurd apparatus. The wheels will turn, but will run to no effect. And so this section I wanted to share a little bit of, because here he is, remember, writing in 1920. Everyone certainly felt it was too early to judge what was going on in the Soviet Union. It had only been a few years. They've been having a war, who knows, right? So it's easy for us to read this and think, yeah, well, obviously, because we just watched a century of socialist disaster after socialist disaster. But he was writing before this all happened, right? 1920. So listen, one may anticipate the nature of the future socialist society. There will be hundreds and thousands of factories in operation, right? They're going to have a GDP. They're going to have a nice big GDP, right? That's the basis.
Yeah, the GDP will go up year on year. Of course it will.
Right.
Of course the GDP, of course, quote unquote, productivity will go up. But is it
we're making
efficient
stuff.
Productivity? We're making shit. Excuse me. Yeah. We're making stuff. But doesn't mean that stuff is worth making. Exactly.
So he says there'll be factories. He's envisioning, he's predicting, right? Prophesying. Very few of these will be producing wares ready for use. In the majority of cases, what will be manufactured will be unfinished goods and production goods. He's describing any economy, really. You don't have every factory producing something where you can just walk up to the factory door and get a finished product, right? A factory has to produce something that is then used by another factory to do something, which is then used by a farmer, or, right? So he says a lot of these, he says in the majority of these cases, they're actually producing what he calls an intermediate good in some places, right? All these concerns will be interrelated, every good will go through a whole series of stages before it is ready for use. In the ceaseless toil and moil of this process, however, the administration will be without any means of testing their bearings. It will never be able to determine whether a given good has not been kept for a superfluous length of time in the necessary processes of production, or whether work and material have not been wasted in its completion. How will it be able to decide whether this or that method of production is the more profitable? At best, it will only be able to compare the quality and quantity of the consumable end product produced, but will, in the rarest cases, be in a position to compare the expenses entailed in production. So this is the central problem. This is the brilliant insight that Mises had. And what did it come from? It came from him understanding how an economy works. That's what I'm trying to sell you on here. The reason that Mises was able to have this searing insight that all these, probably intellectually clever socialists had never thought about in all the writing, the volumes of Das Kapital, et cetera, et cetera. They'd never thought about, like, how will this actually work, And the reason is that they didn't have a good grasp of how an economy works. And Mises did. He didn't just write about socialism. Before this, his path-breaking work had been 8 years before this. He had written his path-breaking work, which we translate as the theory of money and credit, on monetary economics. He understood about money prices, the structure of production, and because he understood how those work in sort of, you might say, the ideal economy, right, an abstract economy, he could understand how the real economy works, and he could predict what it would be like if you tried to do socialism. And what we saw in history is that what he predicted is indeed what happened. And there's a famous, I'm forgetting the guy, some famous socialist economist, I think. He, in the New York Times, after the Soviet Union collapsed, he said, Mises was right. This is in 1991 or something like that. He says Mises was right. We were wrong. Because for all those years, they said, we've disproved Mises. We've shown that it can be done. And the CIA has told us that the Soviet Union is going from strength to strength. They did, by the way.
Yep.
Okay.
And this also comes back to the idea. But was it Mises? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Mises said that even in an economy that is free or semi-free, as we have today, when government, enacts laws or interferes with the market, it throws sand in the gears of the market and it gums it up and it slows it down. And we see this with, very famously, the Austrian business cycle, where you have interest rates that affect the market greatly, hugely important to the market. And when the government interferes with that, when the central bank interferes with that, that's when the disaster starts to happen, because you're allowing for inefficient choices to come into the market, rather than the market constantly correcting itself and being as efficient as possible and satisfying as many needs as possible. When the government steps in, or when the government takes over, there's no way. They create inefficient stuff. Because they have messed with the actual incentives and the actual choices of real people, or not allowed it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So let's say, we're kind of saying the same thing over and over. Real quickly, the administration may know exactly what goods are most urgently needed. Let's imagine that. But it doesn't have the, he says, let's say they know what consumer goods need to be produced. I think it turned out even that was hard to get right, But let's imagine that somehow they know exactly what everybody needs, right, as a consumer good. He says that's only one of two things you need to know for economic calculation. The other thing is the valuation of the means of production. And he says, while you wouldn't get rid of money altogether in the socialist commonwealth, or you need not get rid of money, money won't be an expression of the prices of the factors of production, including labor, by the way. And so money can play no role in economic calculation. So let's give one more example. Picture the building of a new railroad, right? You've got to make the decision. You're the socialist, running the Soviet Union or whatever. Should we build this new railroad? Should it be built at all? If so, which out of a number of conceivable roads should be built. There's many possible paths that we could have the railroad follow. Which one should we do? In a competitive economy, you'd use monetary calculation. This new road, if we put it here, it'll render less expensive the transport of some goods, and you'd be able to actually do some calculation to compare the benefits to the costs of building that railroad, right? And these would be monetary calculations.
I'm going to link a video in chat that is exactly your example.
Oh, really? About railroads? Okay,
yes,
awesome.
no, exactly your example. And it explains incredibly well from the Austrian perspective as why prices are so important for higher order goods.
Yeah, in fact, you got me intrigued, so I'm just saving that off. Oops, shouldn't have done that. Give me just a sec. Sorry, I clicked the link and opened, got rid of our video, which I didn't want to do. Okay, saving that off for later. Thank you.
There's a comment I would like for you to highlight. Colt Maxwell Anderson is about a couple up.
Which one?
It starts with as Mises writes in Socialism. Yeah. It's just they only think about the stationary condition. Now is the best time in the world. And they don't think about innovation to come along. People think, well, you can plan
not just
socialism.
innovation, but just change, right? I mean,
exactly.
We've seen in the West that we've had changes in terms of how many children people have, right? And therefore, in terms of how many schools there are, right? So I remember the school I went to actually closed down. That would have been around 1979. Because there were less children in the school district. And so the elementary school I went to closed down and I had to shift to another school. Well, these are the kinds of things that are going on all the time, right? All kinds of changes like this. Yeah, Mises is going to comment on the static situation. So he says, where one cannot express hours of labor, iron, coal, all kinds of building material, machines, and all the other things necessary for making a railroad in a common unit, it is not possible to make calculations at all. This is, again, such an important insight of this paper. He's saying you've got to understand that you can't just use your intuition or use your, eyeball it and go, well, I guess we'll need about this much iron, this much coal, about this many workers, and then compare that to, well, what if we put the railroad over there, or what if we don't build a railroad at all and we do this other thing? What if we put in a highway so more cars can go that way or something? If you can't reduce all of these heterogeneous factors into something that we can compare to each other, you can't make an economic decision, is his point. Oh, here it is. You anticipated it, Admiral. The static state can dispense with economic calculation. He says, okay, so let's say that the same events in economic life are ever recurring. And the first disposition of the static socialist economy follows on the basis of the final state of the competitive economy. He says we might conceive of one that is rationally controlled from an economic point of view, right? So we just, we're going to switch to socialism tomorrow. We're just going to keep everything the same. And he says, maybe we could do that. But he says this is only conceptually possible. He says, for one thing, economic data are forever changing, as you've been emphasizing. Static nature of economic activity is a theoretical assumption. Part of the reason he's addressing this is because of general equilibrium economics, which has been much abused in mainstream economics, even back then in 1920, I guess. So even with all that change, and then we have the spectacle of a socialist economic order floundering in the ocean of possible and conceivable economic combinations without the compass of economic calculation. So yeah, he says as you transition to socialism, there'll be changes, and socialism can't deal with the changes. Every economic change in the socialist commonwealth becomes an undertaking whose success can be neither appraised in advance nor later retrospectively determined. There is only groping in the dark. Okay, so economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth. Title of the paper and title of this section of the paper. And here, really, he's dealing with something called market socialism. I saw someone in the chat, Jonathan Pohl, talking about Yugoslavia, I believe. I believe they tried to implement market socialism. And that's what he starts to get into. Let's imagine a situation where you have particular branches of a business. So you have departments within a business, and this happens, right? And they exchange with each other. You know, you have the one I know of in my company, you have the graphic design department, and you actually have to like pay them funny money, you know, internal money or whatever. It's not a real market price, right? But it's some way to budget the use of the graphic design department so everybody doesn't just use them for silly reasons, right? So he says, let's imagine that we could do that, but just do it for the whole economy, right? And he says the problem is you don't have private ownership of production. That's where you're going to run into trouble here. And let's see if I can explain this. Yeah, so when the coal syndicate provides the iron syndicate with coal, no price can be formed except when both syndicates are the owners of the means of production employed in their business. And then he gets into a whole thing, which I'm not going to cover, on labor theory of value. Okay, I'm skipping a bit here because I thought it got too deep. And then I didn't want to cover this heavily because I think he's hinting towards the book that Colton brought up, which is Socialism. Colton wasn't exactly right. He says this essay is from that. This was in 1920. Socialism came out, I think, in 1924, but it was somewhat later. And of course, the points he makes here form a crucial intellectual heart of the book Socialism. But in the book Socialism, he deals with a lot of other stuff, in particular, like the incentive type of argument and stuff. The important part about this paper is not the incentive argument. It's the it's the economic calculation argument. But in this section, he's starting to hint towards the broader concerns about socialism that he discusses in more depth in the book Socialism. I just had to share this, though. Karl Kautsky, an important socialist thinker back then, he says, if socialism is a social necessity, then it would be human nature and not socialism, which would have to readjust itself if ever the two clashed. I just love that because it's just a certain kind of leftism summarized, right? If our dreams of what we want society to be happen to clash with human nature, well, humans are going to change. And as we've learned, they're going to be forced to change with force and with cruelty, or they're going to attempt to change people, I should say. Oh, and then here, this is interesting. In sort of the market socialism mode here, he says, if you've ever heard politicians talk about, we're going to run things like a business, you know, that's the problem here. People in government just run things inefficiently. Out there in the market economy, we know how to do things right. So he says, Mises, a popular slogan affirms that if we think less bureaucratically and more commercially in communal enterprises, they will work just as well as private enterprises. The leading positions must be occupied by merchants, and then income will grow apace. So, you know, we just need to get the right people that have the right mindset. But here's what Mises says. Unfortunately, commercial mindedness is not something external, which can be arbitrarily transferred. A merchant's qualities are not the property of a person depending on inborn aptitude, nor are they acquired by studies in a commercial school or by working in a commercial house, or even by having been a businessman oneself for some period of time. The entrepreneur's commercial attitude and activity arises from his position in the economic process and is lost with its disappearance. That is, you can't just take a Steve Jobs, or I don't know, pick your favorite entrepreneur that you think's awesome, and just take them, plop them in charge of the government, and then expect for like amazing things to happen. Because when they're not in the role of the entrepreneur anymore, when they're not functioning in that place in the economy, they're not an entrepreneur anymore, right? It's being in that role in the market economy that allows them to do the things they do. And you can, and again, this is where you get the cargo cult problem. You know, if we get the state to just sort of act business-like, then it'll be like a business, and it just doesn't work that way. Okay, so let me see. We're near the end. Let me see if there's anything else I want to make sure to cover. Go ahead.
I'd just like to jump in there and say, having talked to several politicians who came from the world of private industry, often, yes, they can organize an office. You know, they can manage a team very well. I mean, they came from private industry. That's what they did. But what they can't do is restructure a bureaucracy to be like a business. But oftentimes it's actually the bureaucracy itself that overwhelms this new person coming in and can force them out or can be very resistant to them. Just to make that very clear, that's another aspect that people need to remember, is that, you know, these entrepreneurs, Austrians, we like to talk of them as if, you know, not that they're gods, but that they have found something in the market that makes them very special, and they've satisfied a want. But they aren't supermen, you know. They're not Ubermensch. They're just average people, and they get overwhelmed as well.
Colton's corrected me here. I forgot how early the book Socialism was. It was published in 22. This paper came out in 20, and he's saying it was being written around the time the paper was written. So anyway, they were produced together, this article and the book, and the substance of this article is certainly in the book Socialism. I like it as a standalone, though, for this purpose. Okay, so he actually comments on current events a bit here. And again, talks about this cargo cult problem. He talks about a bank that becomes the socialist bank, right? The central bank of the socialist economy. And he says, again, once the banks merge into a single bank, their essence is wholly transformed. They are then in a position to issue credit without any limitation. Boy, we know about that, don't we, Merck? That rang a bell.
Well, the problem with today is that what we're going through is there's a lot of money in the system. Sorry, not money. There's a lot of currency in the system, but there's not a lot of spending of that money yet. And when this all starts to be used, I think that's when you're going to start to see the hard economic times come. But that's a topic for a whole nother stream.
Right. And so just finishing up with his bank comment, he says, it may be that the name bank is retained, that the Supreme Economic Council of the socialist community is called the board of directors of the bank, and that they hold their meetings in a building formerly occupied by a bank. But it is no longer a bank. It fulfills none of those functions which a bank fulfills in an economic system resting on the private ownership of the means of production and the use of a general medium of exchange, money. It no longer distributes any credit, for a socialist society makes credit of necessity impossible. So anyway, I wanted to call this out because I noticed this theme reading through this paper again, this cargo cult theme, you know, banks that are not really banks. Businessmen that are not really businessmen or entrepreneurs in the sense that we understand them. He says, I think of this in an Aristotelian sense, essence versus accident. The problem with the cargo cult is that they picked up on certain accidental features of the plane that would bring the cargo they wanted, but they missed the essential feature, which is that it was an airplane that could fly and could go and bring stuff from outside the world, right? Well, the socialists do a similar thing. They create banks that don't really fulfill the function of a bank in a market economy, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so I thought that was quite interesting, and we're going to just about wrap up. In his conclusion, he says, let's see, they're wont to overlook the fact that all technical rationality of production is identical with a low level of specific expenditure in the processes of production. Okay, so this is the point I wanted to make about technical versus economic. Especially for those of us who are like in IT, like I am, or engineers of some form, it's easy to get caught up in what we think of as technical problems. You know, how can I make the machine do a certain thing? You know, Mises doesn't think those things are unimportant or anything like that. He just says you've got to distinguish between solving a technical problem and solving the economic problem, because you can solve a technical problem and actually, you know, do some proof of concept. Hey, look, I can make this little thing on my desk fly or something, you know, and people are like, wow, that's cool. And then you say, let's make 1 million of them. And somebody says, no. And you say, well, why? But it's so cool. I solved this amazing technical problem, right? And the answer is because it's not economic. It's not what society is requesting. You know, it's not what people want or need. They don't want to take those resources that it would take to make 1 million of these and use them for that purpose. That second question, you know, once you've sort of shown something is technically possible, that second question of, but should it be done? You know, should it be produced? That is the economic question. And one of the things that Mises is he's addressing this because again and again, he sees that people are, as he says, muddling the conception of technical rationality, which stands in antithesis to economic rationality. These are different kinds of problems you're trying to solve. Technical problems are important, but they're different problems than economic problems, which is how to use the resources of society in a way that makes sense.
I just want to link into chat just really quickly. This is a video by the historian Tick. He's also heavily into Austrian economics.
I don't know if you saw me mention, but I did actually get through a short Tick video, and he's critiquing, and then he says, "Who's got the right answer? Mises." I was like, "Hey, yes. Whoa!"
No, this is a very, very good video by him. And again, if Mr. Tick sees this, I don't know if that's the right way to call him, but if Tick sees this, please, we would love to have a show with you. But
yeah,
this is a video where he explains, and it goes through very deep history of the USSR and the troubles that they had with production and higher order goods and allocation of resources, and how all the way up to the 60s, they were still 60s and 70s actually, they were still having food shortages. And in the 80s, there was a huge food shortage just before the collapse. So, you know, this again, good video to watch. Please go watch it. It explains, again, in real world terms, in a country that existed, how this, how the socialist economic calculation problem can be viewed.
Yeah, and he starts out with his bibliography, I guess. So I just went right to the first thing here, and I noticed 2 papers by Yuri Maltsev, who I mentioned. We see Socialism by Mises. There's Bob Higgs. You know, so great sources, approved.
Yes, I've seen in chat there's a couple individuals who are very knowledgeable about the USSR. And great, we'd love to have you guys watch the show. Thank you for watching, but would love to hear your thoughts about this video.
Yeah,
because that would be an interesting thing to hear.
Okay, just one last thing from the paper, just because I thought it was funny. He's talking about a guy named Muckle, a socialist thinker. He says he's a culture socialist. he says they're not going to be persuaded by my argument here, because for them, all he expects from socialism is the dissolution of the most frightful of all barbarisms, capitalist rationality. So, I mean, he says, if you don't want capitalist rationality, then I guess you're not going to be persuaded by me pointing out that you're not going to get any economic rationality at all from socialism. But then in a footnote, he quotes more from Muckle. He says, on the other hand, Muckle demands the highest degree of rationalization of economic life in order to curtail hours of labor and to permit man to withdraw to an island where he can listen to the melody of his being.
And the seas will turn into lemonade.
And the sea, yeah, that's going back to the utopian socialists. But okay, so that's the paper. Now some further comments. Now that we've got hopefully some of that under our belts. First of all, you could conclude that until the whole world is socialist, we wouldn't fully face what Mises is describing here, because even a socialist country can reference the market prices from neighbors, as we discussed and was actually done. But the lessons we learn from this paper are broader than that 100% global socialism scenario, okay? Because you run into problems well before you hit that scenario. We've never had that scenario, and yet I think that economist in the New York Times was right when he said Mises was proven correct. As each firm or public enterprise, and by the way, and I'm including capitalist firms here, like a Google or whatever, as each capitalist firm or public enterprise or socialist state grows, it becomes an island of calculational chaos. Because instead of using market prices internally, you find that these large organizations start developing department budgets, and they start charging each other prices against those budgets. Those are not market prices, okay? They're kind of stumbling in the dark a bit. And as the organization gets bigger, it has more and more of those problems, where it's buying from itself, so to speak, and its determination of how profitable a line of production is involves these internal prices. And so it's having to kind of throw a dart to know, well, we know we're going to get this from outside the company, but half of this is going to be from within the company. How do we consider that? How costly do we consider that stuff to be? It's, there's clues from the economy around you, but the bigger you get, the less clues you have and the more you're stumbling around.
It's almost like larger corporations almost need a market within their own firm in order to determine the price of what to sell on the actual market. And
well, it's for internal decisions. Internal decisions.
Right. They need it for internal decision making. And this is why these huge multinational corporate, as Bernie said, the top billionaires and millionaires and the corporations, all of these things only can exist when the government supports them. Mm-hmm. When the government doesn't step in and support them, when the government just lets the market be, you find that they become so large, that they become so inefficient, that they start to waste, which opens up a gap in the market that someone else exploits. And you have this dynamism of the market come back into play. Only when the government steps back in to protect, to subsidize, to regulate industry, do these large oligopolies and monopolies exist.
Right, and this is a big emphasis of left libertarians, and to a great degree, they're right, and there's nothing left about it from my point of view. It's just a point that comes out of Austrian economics and the classical liberal and libertarian tradition, that you always had the original fight of the classical liberals. One of the original fights was against monopoly. What was monopoly? It was the government granting a privilege to some company or some lord or something. You get silk production, you get the exclusive right to do silk production in England or something like that. Well, that the classical liberals saw was unjust and inefficient, right? It was precluding competition. It was introducing a little bit of chaos in our world. And when the left libertarians say that these huge companies can't really be products of the free market, they may have a point, as Mad Mark was saying. Now, it's hard to completely know. Could there be, without the state propping it up in various ways, could there still be an Apple or a Google? I don't know. Could there be something half the size of an Apple or a Google? It's hard to say. But we do see, I have seen pretty persuasive arguments that they are essentially being subsidized in various complicated ways. And they know it, and many of them lobby for it, right? To the credit of, say, Apple and Microsoft, until the government sort of came after them, they tried to ignore it and didn't lobby for it. They maybe have got some benefits anyway, but they didn't ask for them. But then once the government came after them as a matter of self-defense, they got involved with lobbying. And then once they were involved with lobbying, right, they're starting to get government contracts and ask for laws to be done in their favor and so on and so forth. So let's go to, by and large, to wrap up my thoughts here. As I understand the movie Wall-E, which I like very much, by the way, I like bringing it up because because I like it and I know it well, but also because it's a peculiar movie in a lot of ways when you think about its depiction of humans. And I think gets away with it because the main characters are not humans, they're robots. And the robots are done really well. But the humans are kind of unrealistic. In particular, in regards to economic calculation, let's talk about By and Large, which as far as I can tell in the movie, is the only company left on Earth, has become the only company left on Earth. And it provides everything from trash collection to the grocery store to space tourism and everything in between, right? So the movie presents something that I have a little trouble buying, okay? It presents the company as having developed fabulous technology that allows it to actually move the entire population of the Earth into space and keep them alive. So it's an incredibly ingenious and efficient company in some sense, right? It just has this slight defect that it trashes the planet, which is the reason it ends up moving everybody off of it, right? And this is presumably because the usual critique, the private companies are short-sighted, they don't take pollution into account, yada, yada, yada. But the reality is that By and Large is impossible because it's going to run into problems way before it's the only company left on the planet. As it becomes anywhere close to that, not even anywhere, it'd have to be 10% of the companies of the planet or whatever. It's going to be so huge and have such chaos within it that it's just going to absolutely break down. And as Mad Merck said, it'll fall apart through competition from outside it of nimbler firms. And this is what you see with big companies. They've always got, in a free economy, when the government doesn't stop it, they've always got smaller, nimbler firms nipping at their heels, and they have to try to figure out how to use economies of scale and be efficient and be innovative to somehow keep from getting torn apart by the pack of dogs, little dogs coming after them, right? Well, By and Large would never get to the point where it would be this single company over the whole planet. It's impossible. And so there's some comfort in this, I think, for those, especially like left-wingers who fear the monopolistic, less and less firms over time, just monopolizing everything. It just can't work. And that's what Mises is telling us. I mean, they can try, maybe they're trying now with, the shutdowns, finishing off so many small businesses and the big businesses just growing bigger and bigger. Maybe they're trying to sort of induce this thing that they always thought capitalism would bring us, fewer and fewer monopolistic firms or whatever. But it just won't work. It won't work for the same reason the Soviet Union didn't work, because they're not going to be able to do economic calculation. They're going to fall apart. And in fact, just to point you to something, if you're interested in the big tech, I forget if I highlighted it last week, but Per Byland talked about the problem with the big tech companies. And on Mises.org, I'll see if I can find the link in a minute and share it. But the main issue, he said, is that they're not consumer-oriented. They're not customer-oriented, I should say. They're oriented towards technology. we've got this cool technology and what can we do with it? He says that's not how to have that's not how to have success. You've got to figure out how to serve customers, and then maybe the technology can help you do that, right? But when you do it the other way around, you have problems. And so he argues that these seemingly super powerful companies that have now censored the president of the United States, President Trump, and just seem to be able to do anything they want. He says that this isn't going to last long. He thinks that they're a paper tiger, as we say about China. And I'll share his argument for you to consider. I think it's quite interesting. And Per Byland, as usual, I should always recommend, is someone really to follow, like on Twitter, or just seek out his articles. Okay, so let's do some super chats. I'll see.
I'd just like to add. I'd like to add one thing real quickly. We're talking about more contemporary politics here, and I guess we'll get into it. These companies, yes, we talk about, yes, they will eventually become so big that they are essentially, if not already, assets of the state, and become inefficient like the state because they can't do economic calculation. But they can take a hell of a lot of people on the way out with them.
Oh yeah, well, sure.
Yeah. Just like
as we saw with the socialist systems, right?
Yes,
they were very deadly.
Yes, these socialist systems. Yes, we all knew that they were going to fail. This was inevitable, but they took a hell of a lot of people out with them on the way out, and it took them a while. So just do not. I say this over and over again. Do not be surprised at how long a bad system can linger on for. And for what I think we might be heading into in the future with the mixture of corporation and the state working together very closely, and these larger corporations essentially becoming entities of the state, if not in name but in practice. Read Vampire Economy. Vampire Economy is a book about fascist Italy and National Socialist Germany, and how the state basically, in effect, nationalized all industry while still keeping them semi-private. It's a very interesting book. Please go read it. I think that might be where we're headed. Maybe not exactly, but, just be prepared for that sort of future and try and learn what to do in order to survive, so you see at least the other side.
Okay, I'm just sharing that from Per Byland. So I'm pointing out the problem of the size of the big tech guys. He's actually coming at it from a different angle here, and says that they're how does he put it here? He says the problem with and for Silicon Valley is their lack of entrepreneurship. Yes, really. They're bad at being entrepreneurs, at providing the entrepreneurial function in the economy. To put it differently, they are technology-driven in their profit-seeking, but not consumer-driven. So anyway, and it goes on from there. So I recommend it to you. Per Byland, I talk about it in our Discord, but I don't know how much I've shared on the show. Per Byland writes these tweet threads that are little like mini essays on Twitter, and they're really worth your time. He's a great teacher of Austrian economics. Okay, so we have a few super chats, so let's do those. And they're all from, so far, they're all from our hero, Mickey the Fourth. He says, cheers from the land of the beer and beautiful women. Good evening to you all. He's from Czechia. And in fact, he has offered, and I think we're going to take him up on it, to help us do a show about Czechia. And I think we have a very interesting angle on Czechia, even if you don't particularly care about Czechia itself. I think the story he has to tell will be of great interest. But anyway, sneak little teaser there. He says, don't forget to use innovative, this is when I was talking about supporting the show. Don't forget to use innovative sponsorship methods, as when I sent Super Chat to Tim Pool and instantly boosted the channel by a few hundred people. LOL. Yes, absolutely. That was great. In fact, do I have super chats here? Okay. What he did is, it was not just Tim Pool, it was Styx, Hexenhammer, and Tim Pool. He did super chats shilling our show or the channel. And indeed, we were a little bit under 3,000 subscribers. And after his shilling, we shot well over 3,000. So he helped us break that little barrier and added a few hundred subscribers. So that's great. Oh, and welcome if you're joining us for the first time. And then the last one I get to put on the screen because I've still got it in my cache here. Mickey the Fourth. Fun fact, in my country, we basically have elements of labor theory of value codified in law. But that could be discussed on a different occasion. For example, an episode about the politics of said country, which we're already discussing. Yeah, boy, I should add that to my notes so we don't forget. I would be very curious how the labor theory of value is in the law in Czechia. So probably not a thrilling, probably not a great idea for the people of the Czech Republic, but
no,
we'll have to hear about that. Okay, so anything we want to say?
There's one more super chat, I think.
Okay, let's see if I can pull that up here. Here we go. Ralph Gilsonen says, just read I Pencil. It's a short essay. Everyone should read it. Yes, in fact, let's just, I love my own view, or at least our show should be footnoted. That's my view.
Agreed.
So Leonard Reed. Let me just get that link in there. He's right. It is quite short. And it really can change your view, I think. Because for good reason, we know our little corner of the world and we don't necessarily know everything else. And with iPencil, he broadens your mind. Thanks, Ralph, for reminding us to promote that essay. He broadens your mind to think about not just going to the store and buying a pencil, but how did this pencil get here? Which turns out to be a lot more interesting than you'd ever expect. You'd think, oh, that sounds, pencil production. Wow. No, I mean, this essay, people love it. It's been read and reread for decades now. It's some people only know of Leonard Reed, even though he was a fabulously accomplished libertarian activist, started the Foundation for Economic Education, the oldest libertarian organization still around. He did so much, but a lot of people only know of Leonard Reed because of this little essay called I Pencil. And if you read it, you'll understand why. It's just fabulous. So thanks for that, Ralph. Okay, well, let's stop for now, Matt Merck, I guess, right?
Yeah, we again, guys, I need to make a reminder. We are looking at alternative platforms, so be aware of that. If you're on the Discord, we may be looking at a Discord alternative as well. We need to discuss that, and we need to find out what we can use for that. We may be using Entropy, we may be using other Discord alternatives, but we are determined not to be censored in the future. We are determined to continue to bring you this sort of content to try and grow. When we switch over and get new platforms, we will let you know. We already have a BitChute, so if you want to go follow us there, you can see older streams we've uploaded there. Look, this is an uneasy time. We don't know what's going to happen, especially with everyone being kicked off. We could be gone tomorrow. So if you haven't joined the Discord, you'll get regular updates there. You can do topic suggestions there if you want to do a show, see a show, sorry. And we will keep you informed as best as possible. But we have no idea what will happen.
Thank you for bringing up the Discord. That's one thing I didn't mention at the beginning of the stream, and I did want to mention that because I suspect we have some new people. I will share that link. Somebody asked for the Discord link. It's on my Twitter, so I'll just pull it up. I'm glad that you brought up the Discord. Sorry, there we go. We always announce the show. So that's, if you like the show, that's one thing that it does for you, is if you see your Discord notifications, then we are not notification heavy, but certainly you'll get one each week to say, hey, show's coming up, and a pointer to the YouTube link so that you can make sure to not miss the show. So that's a very practical reason to join the Discord. But there's so much more. We ran a wonderful contest at the end of the year where people won some silver coins. Oh, I'm happy to say that all those silver coins arrived safely to our 3 winners, for second and third prize winners. So we ran a contest last year using the Discord. And we have discussion on a number of topics related to the topics of the show. And it's just a great community, and it's growing, and we'd love to have you part of it. That Discord link is in the description of the YouTube description of this episode, so you can find that. And I thought I had my BitChute link in here, and I don't. Okay. Sorry, give me just a sec before we go off air. I just want to get the BitChute in there because someone asked for it, and that's a very reasonable request. There, I think I just do the channel, right? Yep. Okay, here we go. That's the BitChute channel, and it used to for like 2 videos, it would auto upload the video from when we did it on YouTube. It would just show up on BitChute a little while later. That has not been working. So I've got some homework to do. I've downloaded a lot of our videos, and I need to get them re-uploaded to BitChute, ideally with the art and everything. So that'll be some monkey work. Would love to have a helper on that, but not sure how we'd do that. I think it could be done. So anyway, thanks all. Thank you, Jonathan. Have a good day to everybody. And thanks, Mad Merc.
All right, bye everyone. Have a good one. Stay safe.